Namaste. Welcome to the Hindu Parenting Podcast. In today's episode, we will talk about something that plays a very important role in our lives, yet we don't pay any attention to it. It's like a magic key. When used well, it can open doors for us professionally and also help us deal with children and peers successfully. So, what is this magic key? It's the ability to use language, to employ precise words at the right time to communicate. As Hindus, as parents, as friends seeking to influence and persuade people to see our point of view. How many of us are taught this important skill? And who better to talk to us about precise communication than Professor Vamsee Juluri, who teaches media studies at the University of San Francisco. He is the author of many books, both fiction and non-fiction. Professor Juluri writes for many popular newspapers and magazines in the US and in India. He is widely acknowledged as a thought leader in the Hindu space, and it is in this capacity that we wish to hear from him today. Namaskaram, Vamsee Garu. Welcome to the podcast.
Namaskaram, Rekha Garu. It's a pleasure to be on Hindu Parenting. I listened to the podcast and you cover so many fascinating topics that all generations and all times will find useful.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. We are honored and delighted that you're here today. My personal journey of decolonization started with the media, with the kind of coverage that was so negative, that continues to be so negative and wholly disconnected from reality on India and about Hindus and Hinduism in particular. So I came across your writings at that time, and I was happy that there is something called media studies. I had not known that before, and that there are people like you who are speaking up for the Hindu side. So let's hold that thought on explaining media studies and come back to it a little while later. Mm-hmm. I'd like to start with an important task Hindu parents have of sensitizing children to the Hindu story. We have unfortunately not been very good at this. And I think that some part of it is definitely due to our fuzzy communication skills. We use words like right-wing, leftist, and most of us do not realize that they come preloaded, and we are missing some of the nuances there. So we use these words, and they are probably perceived very differently by even our own children when they hear us. Your thoughts on this?
Yes. I'm so glad we are starting with the nuts and bolts and the details, which is 3 or 4 concrete words, right wing, left wing, woke, and things like that, because this is the currency of our reputation, our existence, our future, our destiny. We use these terms freely these days. But what baggage they come with, what consequences they have, whether they are having the persuasive effect we hope they do, all of this is something we are not really paying attention to. And it's understandable because we are so busy in our careers, with other things that, words just seem like, tools that we pick up here and there and use as we go along, and everything is fine. But what we fail to understand is communication is like building a huge, monument or a building. Your life, every one of our lives is like building a great temple, or to use a global example, the pyramids or the Taj Mahal or something. There is an architecture that each of us is building for our reputations, for our identities. And the tools or the building block of this architecture is the word. And what has happened now is, on the one hand, these buildings that we're building is not just private. It's very, very public because we're all leaving our signatures on social media. And if you're a parent today and you're on Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp, your children are watching you build, this Tower of Babel, if you, or some sort of a building. And, what it looks like to you, being comforted in the habit of the words you use, like right wing or left wing, is very different from the image that your children are, seeing. So I want to actually start by invoking a communication lesson, or rather two communication lessons from two Hindu parents before we get into more details on this. This is the Hindu parents are, of course, my mother and father, my Amma and Nana Garu. My father was a professor of zoology. He taught at Osmania University in Hyderabad for many years. And of late, I've started to really regret that I never heard him give a lecture on his subject. I have heard his students tell me that he was a wonderful teacher, and generations of his students, remember him very fondly. And, one of the unexpected blessings of writing about Hinduism is sometimes my father's old students read my articles on Hinduism or media somewhere, and then they do some research, and then they write to me and say, hey, I was your father's student, and you have his gift. And I feel very blessed when they tell me that. But I do regret I never heard my father actually stand in the classroom and give a lecture. Now, my mother, on the other hand, fortunate, her communication legacy, all the beautiful monuments she built through her communication in her life and work are preserved in time. They're going to be preserved in history. For your listeners who may not be aware, my mother is the famous multilingual film star Jamuna, who acted in hundreds of Telugu movies, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi. And then in the 80s, she was also in politics. She was elected to parliament. My mother passed away just earlier this year in January. So my mother and father are both, I think, exemplars of not just Hindu parenting in a way, but also perhaps Hindu communication. So I just want to invoke both of them for a moment and, recognize that each of them probably imprinted what it means to communicate. My father as a teacher and my mother as a performer, as an actor, and also as a politician, and of course also in everyday life. So, so to bring these two things together, I think what's happening right now is, are we going to be in a position where 10 or 20 years from now, our children can look back at us and say, hey, our parents left such a wonderful legacy for us in terms of the language they used or how they spoke or how they understood the world. And this is something worth living up to. And unfortunately, when you focus on some of the building blocks we are using, these labels and smears like woke or left wing or right wing. I understand the critique. I fully understand the Hindu pain, the Hindu grievance, because there is so much untruth in the media today. There is so much untruth in education today, in schools and colleges. We feel angry, we feel helpless. So we pick up these words from the internet, which seem like they're very effective. But unfortunately, they're not working the way we think they do in space, that is, in convincing the mainstream. And even more problematically, they are not working in terms of reaching almost anybody who is under 30 today. So to summarize this point, I'll just say this. What you think is an insult, what you think is a fringe belief, like, oh, this is when you call somebody a cultural Marxist or you call somebody a leftist, you may think you are recognizing a fringe belief. But to almost anybody under 30 today, especially if they're going to a good, quote unquote, good school or good college, and Hindu parents, particularly in the US, are very, very, motivated to get their children into Ivy League and Harvard and Yale and Berkeley and all. What you think is a fringe belief is actually the mainstream, and it's not just the mainstream, it is a highly valued mainstream, because to your children, when you use liberal as a bad word, it sounds unfathomable, right? It sounds like you're against human rights, you're against equality, you're against social justice, you're against the environment. And it becomes very easy for organized forces to plant the idea in children's minds that parents are regressive or right-wing or fascist or whatever. I mean, if an adult today is himself calling himself a right-wing, why blame their professors later and say, the professors brainwashed my kid in college, right? So the key point again here is, I don't ever remember my father or mother using language like this. They did hint at what their understanding of Hinduism, even in a political sense, was, and it was very nuanced. They appreciated all the writing I was doing. But in terms of politics, I think they were much more nuanced than many of us are today, which is good. But the bottom line here is my parents were not harsh in the way they described the world. I mean, there could be, let's face it, in any family, when people on difficult issues, sometimes you have difficult interpersonal conversations and, we say mean things to each other and all that. But in terms of describing the world at large, I find it hard to remember any example of my mother and father saying anything harshly. Both of them saw the world with a lot of generosity, understanding, and from the depth of a life well lived, and a life well lived in surrender to our gods, our traditions, our elders. So that is sort of the big picture on this I wanted to start with.
But if I may just come in here, the point is also that this jargon that we use these days, I don't think any of us were exposed to it when we were growing up. The words themselves were not there, at least in India. I don't know, perhaps in the US they were there, but in India, actually, until I think probably the advent of social media, and probably this decade is when we have heard these words like right wing, left wing, and the latest, of course, is the woke. I hadn't heard of the term woke before 2 years, perhaps, 2 years back, or maybe 3 years max. I wouldn't have heard the word woke. So this terminology itself is so new. So wouldn't it be if I were to say, if your parents were in today's world with all the social media that everyone has access to, do you still think that they might not have been influenced by the usage of these sort of terms? It's widely bandied about now. Anybody and everybody uses these terms. It's just so common. So just wanted to see what you think of that.
Well, I'm glad my parents were not on social media. And no, you're absolutely right in the sense that, you're drawing attention to the fact that words have a social history, a political pedigree, and a political consequence, or rather psychopolitical consequence. So these words were not in play in this sense, and we simply were not exposed to communication on the same scale and intensity as 20, 30 years before because of the kind of new technologies that have come. I think one big change that took place in terms of the Indian experience of communication is, first, it started in the 90s, I would say, with satellite television, the whole boom that took place then. And because there were just so much more content now, so many more channels, people were picking up on new ideas and phrases and so on. then with social media, naturally, it has become a lot more pronounced. Now, the thing is, I think what has happened is, this sort of leads us into a point I was going to make later, but I think it's worth maybe just spelling it out right now. And it has to do with how we learn. Okay. And I think one of the big challenges we have is that, and this is an idea I picked up from S.N. Balagangadhara's book, As Others See Us, which is sort of a dialogic version of some of his, more scholarly works. And Balagangadhar talks about the transmission of traditions of, of what culture means and what it means to live after colonization and things like that. And a key observation he made, which I found very useful, is that the Indian way of learning typically is, I think, through imitation. Okay? And this was perhaps the way in most pre-modern societies too. You learn by imitating your elders, your peers, and so on. Whereas the Western way is more theory-oriented. And so think about it. Now, 2-3 generations ago, if there was a sculptor, or even to this day, I was recently at the beautiful Kawai temple, and the Stapatis were there from Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, I think, building this amazing Shiva temple in the middle of the beautiful Hawaiian forests. And so you think of the learning there. Now, there is a Shastra, there are these sacred texts, but you can see how from one generation to another, that skill in making the temple, in sculpting, is perhaps learned largely through imitation, through practice. And same with dance, same with music, and same with communication. We learn through imitation. Now, in the Western model, on the other hand, there is a tradition of teaching the theory behind everything. And I think what has happened in the modern Indian experience, that is, say, the last 3 to 4 generations, last 100 to 120, 150 years, is we have picked up a bit of the Western model. So we get into the theory for a few things, like maybe for science, for engineering, and so on. Although from what I remember of my 2 years in engineering, there also we mugged up a lot. But when it comes to communication, particularly when it comes to politics, when it comes to sociology and the social sciences, we are unfortunately just doing this imitation business. And I think what has happened, particularly with social media, is we are imitating whatever our feeds show us, right? Our WhatsApp groups, our Facebook, Twitter, etc., Instagram, etc. And there is very little theoretical self-reflection or critique on the nature of language. Now, by contrast, almost anybody in the modern world, in the Western world, frankly, is a trained communicator. It's a very deep part of their society. I picked up a book recently in a library sale called Language Intelligence. This is a little handbook. And it says, the subtitle is Lessons on Persuasion from Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga. So,
diverse.
Yeah, very diverse, from Shakespeare to Lady Gaga. And, this book is very fascinating. So it goes back to Aristotle and, ancient Greek ideas of rhetoric, and they get to political rhetoric, the 80s and 90s. So one of the things that seems to have happened in the US politically in terms of communication is till the 1990s or so, the conservatives or the right wing had a major advantage on communication. And starting in the 90s, the other side worked on it very hard. In fact, one of the questions we were going to, we've talked about on occasion is the idea of framing. And, there's a book by Professor George Lakoff on, on framing, the idea of how to frame a conversation. So one of the things that has happened, I think, is, the right and left have switched places in the US on many counts, but particularly in terms of who has the communication advantage. So today, I think the main challenge is there is a very organized force for creating a vocabulary, creating a frame for understanding the world. And it is coming out from forces or organizations or institutions which have been historically Hindu-phobic or heathen-phobic. And so that's what we are up against. And I think our old method of simply imitating, learning from what we find from our peers or from our social media is not effective anymore. We need to understand the theory behind things.
How much of this is also because we are playing the game on somebody else's terms? I mean, the English language is new to us, considering we may have been educated completely in English, but the way a native English speaker thinks about the words is itself so different. And many of these terms come loaded, right, with some connotations that we simply refuse to see, or we have no idea what is going on. I mean, we come from a culture where word is Vak Devi, and also, our culture has this concept of Shabda Brahman. And so there's a lot of importance on sound, on the word. But I guess we have kind of lost it because at some point a fracture has occurred. And, to make the switch culturally and intellectually into a totally different language is not easy, and we miss a lot of nuance. Is this something that could, be affecting us as well?
Absolutely. One of the strange realizations I've had I would say in the past few years is, how little I knew the backstory of English. And, because this is something we just take for granted because, many of us are post-Macaulay. So we have the blessing or the curse of being educated in English. And for many of us, modern Indians, modern Hindus, English has become the primary language of communication. And now, I mean, I spoke Telugu with my mother, I spoke English with my father. At home, we speak both, but generally, I think we tend to lean more towards Telugu at home. And I'm grateful for that. But, the disruption that has happened in terms of, I don't know whether it is because of, this rush we have towards STEM and engineering in modern Indian families, or what it is, but there is very little awareness of the indigenous or our own traditional theories of communication and linguistics and philosophy and so on, or art for that matter. I was recently sent a copy of a book on the Natya Shastra by Professor Ramesh Rao and others, published by the Motilal Banarsidass Press. And it's a beautiful book. It's called Natya Shastra, a study on continuity and progress of Indian communication theorizing and practice, Kapil Kumar Bhattacharya, Biplab Loha Chaudhary, and Ramesh Rao. So there is a lot in here still. There is I think certainly a rediscovery, a revival happening in traditional theories of knowledge, and like your own course that you did with the children, Rekha Garu, which was brilliant, where you demonstrated how theories of Indian theories of rhetoric and communication can be useful today. So all of that is happening, but I think there is certainly a need to recognize where English comes from, where the words we use come from, and indeed where the society we live in today and take for granted and we believe is universal comes from. And I think that is where Bal Gangadhar's work and those of his students is very, very useful, because what many of us grew up thinking is the modern, secular, universal, endpoint of world progress that we should aspire to is just secularized Christianity. So I think understanding the Western experience the Western experience of Christianization, of its own colonization in a sense, by a certain story, by a certain worldview, and then how that worldview sort of secularized itself, it had its enlightenment and so on, but then how that worldview imposed itself on the rest of us. We are starting to patch that story together. We're talking about colonialism and decolonization and so on. But somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of something very important right under our nose, right in front of our faces, and that is that communication is not neutral. Words are not just a tool we use; these are forces which end up using us if we are not careful. So I think again, one of the ways to get a handle on this maybe is also to start looking at colonization and decolonization in generational terms. So that's why I think speaking about the young and to the young and for the young is very important, because colonialism did not stop in 1947. It's just progressing more and more. On the one hand, politically, there is people talk about pushing back, and India is rising and all these things, and that might be true. But in terms of our ability to get back to our core strengths, our cultural strengths, there's a lot more work that has to be done. And for that, I think an intergenerational perspective is really necessary.
I'd also like to point out this, when you mentioned that most of us are into STEM. So the Indian Hindu parents' lack of interest in social sciences, I think it's hurting us a lot. We have no background about some of these terms, because I think the the terms are used very differently by social scientists, right? When you study communication, when you as you have been trained in all these theories, you probably have a much deeper understanding of these words, and when they can be used, and when they should not be used. And I think that sort of that sort of a realization is most of us are not there. And I think when we have no background, it's kind of hard to communicate even with our children, because their perception is being shaped by institutions. And we are speaking two different languages at one point. And so is there, how can we get out of this mess? Can communication skills be learned? Can we get better at this?
Oh, that is such a great question. Can communication skills be learned? So I'll try to give a quick recap of how I learned about communication, and now basically I think the big difference between a layperson's conversation about anything in the social sciences broadly and something that an academic is doing is that an academic has spent years and years studying a particular stream of literature. Okay? There is a lot of research done in various fields of study. It could be sociology or psychology, or increasingly neuroscience, for example, anthropology, politics, etc. And all of these are organized institutionally, and let's face it, unfortunately or fortunately, it's most of it is now in the West. I think there is not much we have, in terms of institutional preservation back in India, but maybe in the future it'll get better. So the literature in communication and media studies, broadly can be understood as follows. So in 1975, there was a landmark essay written by a scholar named James Carey, who proposed that, if you look at the whole history of communication studies, there are two broad views of communication that we find. The more common sense popular view is what he calls the transmission view of communication. So when you look at communication as a process of sending information or messages from point A to point B, person A to person B, that is what he calls the transmission view. So most of the time, let's think about it. When you talk about communication, that's what we are talking about. Okay, how do I convince my children that Hinduism isn't innately evil? How do I communicate to them that if their professor tells them that, Hinduism is nothing but Brahmins invading, South Asia and colonizing and enslaving the Aboriginal population, how do I convey the right information? I am reading all these new books now, and I need to transmit this information. So that is one way of thinking about communication. You have a fact, or you have some data, you have some information, and you want it to reach a certain target. And now increasingly, perhaps parents are finding that, it's not really working. So maybe it's not just transmitting the facts, but also understanding the complexity of how we communicate. That's also important. And there are books which teach people persuasion and rhetoric and all these things. But I want to stay on Carey's article, because Carey says this particular view of communication as transmission is, while being the common sense view and the dominant view, is really all about controlling objects and people over space. And it is not the only way of thinking about communication. Okay. So he says this particular way of thinking about communication became commonplace during the Industrial Revolution, like the 1850s to 1890s, early 1900s, and so on, when society, the industrial forces of production, pretty much took over the whole planet, and everything was about communication was reimagined really as being able to send messages very quickly to vast populations. The invention of the telegraph, the printing press, and radio, later television, and now the internet, and so on. The whole emphasis is on networks, it's on control, it's on, of course, compliance. So to give us an example of a society in which the transmission view dominates, think about what's going on with all the, Facebook and Twitter and truth-telling things that come up. You use certain keywords and you get demonetized or you get blocked. So everything is about communication as a form of control. So that's the transmission view. And most of the time when we say, how do we improve our communication skills, that's what we're talking about. But Carey tells us that there was an older view of communication, which he calls the ritual view. Now, the ritual view of communication tries to understand communication as a process, as an experience, really. And so he talks about how, when he gives the example of, I guess, the church, when he says, when people go to church and sing some song, they're not really singing that song literally only to transmit a message, to God. They're also singing it to feel that, have that experience. So he's trying to say that a lot of communication takes place not with the intent or goal of transmitting data or controlling information, but simply to for us to enjoy a qualitative experience of being in communication, with each other. Now, Carey says both these views have come out of religion, or the Western experience of religion. He says that the transmission view really, after secularization, takes the form of, human rights and the United Nations and what today you might call one might call the woke agenda. But really, he says it does go back to the Christian idea of spreading the word, of expanding a particular message or worldview all across space, across all populations, and so on. The ritual view, he says, is more about preservation of relationships in time. That is just one theoretical perspective I wanted to share on how do we improve communication skills. By recognizing that there is a literature in communication studies, and one good meta article or summary of this literature is James Carey's two views of communication, the transmission view and the ritual view. And applying that to, I think, to the Hindu context, this is where all of this has been leading me more and more, is to start seeing Hinduism less as a vast organization or a collective in space, but more as micro traditions which are trying to exist in time. Okay? And I think that is really the fundamental insight any communication that we try to have needs to build on, that we need to start looking at our own lives more and more in terms of time, in terms of intergenerational relationships. And that's why I kind of started with my own parents, because the more we try to fight this battle of rhetoric and propaganda, as if our past didn't exist, and as if our future is only going to be what we try to control it, is not going to work. So I think that's one way of cultivating a ritual approach to communication, as Carey might call it. Start thinking more and more about the experience of communication across generations. What are the best memories you can take of your childhood with your parents, say 20 or 30 years ago? What are the memories they shared with you of their childhood, 6, 7 decades ago? And how best can you convey that into the memories of your children? Okay. So we need these vertical bridges, because everything in the curriculum today, if you look at this in a systematic way, and that's all I do as a media researcher, I tend to do textual and content analysis of almost anything I see. I go to our library, I look at what's in the children's section. I look at social media, movies, pop culture, all these things fairly attentively and systematically. And what I see is a complete erasure of intergenerational experiences and communications in culture today. So much of it is just about peer groups being shown a reflection of themselves, as if they're going to be living in this bubble of 15 to 25-year-old, let's change the world and have a revolution, fantasy their whole lives. Whereas those of us who are in our 40s or 50s, who have become parents or even grandparents, we are already equipped by nature, by the inevitable process of aging, by time, to say, hey, our children are going to get old too. They're going to be in their 20s and 30s and 40s before you know it. And while we have invested so much in educating them on skills and getting a job, have we invested in this experience of communication where they're going to carry these memories of having a childhood where they've learned about different generations together? Are they prepared for what life is going to be like when they're 40 or 50? And not just in terms of careers, but in terms of having a fulfilling life. And this is where I think this idea of propaganda and recognizing the impact of propaganda is extremely important, because qualitatively speaking, if you look at something called a generation gap, I know people say, oh, there's always been a generation gap. Even the ancient Greeks were complaining about their youth. That may be the case, but the gap that has been created, the abyss that has been created by the nature of technology, by the nature of sociological change between, say, somebody who's a parent and a child today in the 2020s is quite different from, say, somebody who was a parent and child in the 1920s, or let's say in the 1820s. The amount of change between two generations is just much, much bigger now for the last 4 or 5 generations. And I think, so that is the sort of sociological change we have to recognize. And that is the richness of communication, also we have to practice seeing, go beyond transmission, go beyond just data and facts to looking at the quality of our interactions and conversations with each other. Hope
So
that made sense.
I have something here. So actually, I mean, going back to your thing on Carrie's theories. So if you see what's playing out right now, it's probably a tussle between the ritualistic and the what did you call the other one?
Transmission.
The transmission thing, which is the more Christian. It has its roots in that proselytizing ways of Western religions, right? So in India, what's playing out, isn't it a conflict between or a tussle between the two? Because the parent generation currently grappling with their kids who are on social media, the parent generation is more, I would say, probably it has erased even post independence, I think, but still I think the parents generation 40s 50s today still have a ritualistic sort of core, but their kids are being bombarded with the other form, so don't you think that this is a tussle that's playing out in the Indian space, and how we navigate this would be very important?
Yeah, well said. I mean, in a sense, I think Carrie's article is very relevant because, again, if you apply it to whatever it is that we call Hinduism, Hinduism is not a transmission-oriented culture in the sense that, we are not set up to expand one doctrine or one book or
Exactly.
one ritual across space, but we are habitually accustomed to preserving it over time.
Yeah.
And that is where you have the necessity for recognizing that intergenerational transmission does not just mean quote unquote caste, and it's everybody's micro traditions, and under the guise of ensuring economic social justice, you have a war on cultural transmission. And I want to give a vivid example of this, so that, parents and children can recognize what's at stake. I wrote an article recently in the print about the controversy in Tamil Nadu when the son and grandson of, I guess, the ruling dynasty there, made a statement saying that Sanatana Dharma is like a disease and must be eradicated. And they actually had a conference, by the same name. And a lot of people defending it, saying, oh, he just meant caste, and caste is, abhorrent, and, this and that. And, the whole critique of caste, let's face it, is based on the premise that there is inequality, there is inequity, there is injustice, which is being inherited. That is why we have reservations. That is why we have this whole idea that, we need to have, special policies because historically some communities have been excluded from opportunities and have been exploited and so on and all these things. Now, when you look at the situation more closely, what do you see? You have somebody who has inherited enormous privilege, economic and political privilege, basically attacking, let's cut to the chase here, basically attacking the tradition of cultural heritage, and particularly the figure of the Brahmin. Because let's face it, the entire discourse about caste in India is premised on the idea that the Brahmin has is the richest or the wealthiest or the most powerful person and has kept all this wealth hoarded up for centuries. And now you have not just one generation, but 3 generations of very wealthy families, spouting very, very destructive rhetoric and enacting policies which reduce, traditional cultural practitioners like the priests, the archakas, and so on to poverty and so on. So I'm mentioning this because again, you see a breakdown in an understanding, a breakdown in an ability to just look at what is actually happening around you. So what has happened instead is, instead of looking at the most obvious fact here, which is the difference between economic inheritance and cultural inheritance, the communication is now around on this is taking place in two different silos, right? So you have the parents' generation, which probably says, "Oh, all this is communism and Marxism, and this is bad," without really conveying to children that, hey, the key point here is, I mean, economic suffering, poverty, all of this are bad. That's true, and but is destroying Hinduism, destroying temples, or attacking traditionally poor Brahmins, the way to ensure that more poor people are uplifted. That's the obvious thing. Now, young people, on the other hand, of course, are now completely stuck in this worldview that the only way to get social justice is to destroy "quote unquote" Brahmanism, whatever that means. While the most privileged people, who have inherited wealth, a great deal of wealth, are saying the same thing. So, how do we deal with this? To answer your question, sorry, I hope that example connected in some way with what you asked and what I'm trying to say. But I think, in a sense, with Hinduism, there is no Hinduism without practice. And then, in a way, that, well, of course, Bal Gangadhar and his students don't like the word Hinduism. They don't use it. But in a sense, I think we all know from experience that there is no real theory. I mean, the theory is something that modern Hindus are now trying to come up with to tell their children. Like, for example, in the Chinmaya Bal Vihar, there's a very popular book called Why Do We? Right? And the children like it, and parents find it very useful. So why do we light a lamp? Why do we keep a bottu? Why do we, say namaste? So it gives a rationale for everything we do. So I think it is an attempt to offer a theory for our practices. Now, hundreds of generations, nobody really offered an explanation why. You just did it because your parents did it or your grandparents did it. Now, I think there is a bit of that, like you said, there's a lot of things we just did because our parents did. But I think what has happened, at least let's say in my generation, what in the US would be called Gen X, people who had their childhoods in the 70s, teenage years in the 80s, and who are in their 40s or 50s now. In the Nehruvian generation, the Gen X generation, maybe a bit in the millennial generation, there was a kind of a change where we had fairly secularized, growing up years, but over the 20s or 30s, slowly through practice, we came back and we also started to ask, what are the reasons for these practices? And we felt satisfied. Our modern minds, I think, felt satisfied that there was some, benefit or some use that these rituals belong to a certain worldview, a certain cosmology, and we're happy doing what we do. Now, the question is for somebody under 20 today. I actually don't know what is going to be more effective. Is it more effective to give them more and more theory and hope that that applies to them, and they will preserve Hinduism and they'll go back to rituals because of that? Or will they just pick up on the theory side of it, and say that, hey, I've read the Vedas.pdf, as my friend Heli Kalyan, who's a wonderful young scholar, we should puts it. Are people going to just get misled or misguided, by poor translations or pop publishing, mythologies and so on, or are they going to find new, creative, meaningful, and also traditionally anchored understandings as they go along? So my quick answer to this basically is, I think at the moment there's a lot of work being done, or a lot of effort being put into explaining the theory of Hinduism. And I think the practice, the experience, the ritual is important. But where we do need more theory is a Hindu theory of colonialism, a Hindu theory of the West, a Hindu theory of the monotheisms, and building on the work that was done by, say, Ram Swarup and Sitaram Goel, 30, 40 years ago, and really trying to explain a Hindu theory of society. And I think it is new. I feel like we didn't really, our ancestors did not maybe put in that much effort into making theories of society, or maybe we did for our own sake to to help us live through our own conditions. But a theory about the West, a theory about colonialism, all of these I think are fairly new intellectual challenges for that. And we're, I think, just starting the process.
Perhaps we are 1,000 years. No, I was saying perhaps we are 1,000 years. We have 1,000 years to catch up. I think we've not done, the theory of society from the time I think we started to get invaded. Somehow we just lost that ability to, check on what their premises are, and it's led us to this, perhaps.
Yeah, some of that also becomes clear from what Vamsee Garu has been saying, right? About the emphasis on ritual practice in our society versus this new need to come up with theories. And so this is something we are still, I think, learning to navigate.
Yeah, that's true.
Indeed. Yeah. I think, I mean, at the moment, what we have is a bit of an imbalance where we're trying to do a lot of theorizing about our own self, theorizing about our rituals and traditions and so on. And that's hit and miss because, let's face it, again, we're in the age of social media. There's a gigantic glut of information and it's hard to be discerning. And the only way to be discerning is to, I think, acquire some propaganda detection skills and just be aware of how widespread propaganda is and how easy it is to plant disinformation and misleading theories. But we are very much, following the rituals of the modern world. So we don't theorize the modern world as much as we theorize our own selves. So I think if we made an active effort to kind of, do things the other way, maybe do rituals our own rituals a little more, even if we don't understand them, with an open mind. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, most of the time when we do pujas, we feel good. I think that's the beauty of Hinduism.
True,
that if you do
true.
Satyanarayana Vratam or Ganesha Puja, even if you sat for a long time, it's beautiful. You're surrounded by flowers and leaves. You're chanting beautiful sounds in your mantras, and there's nothing unpleasant here. And at the end of it, we have very delicious food to eat. So doing all these things experientially and doing it together as a family, obviously these are beautiful things. Now, in terms of theorizing, I think, I have to mention this example because, a friend of mine recently told me an example of a wedding he had been to, a sort of a culture shock wedding. And, where he said, and I've heard stories like this from at least 2 or 3 people. It was sort of a Hindu wedding, but he says it was sort of so, what's the word, repackaged, where the moment you went in, everything became, most of the rituals were sort of put aside, and constantly there was this parents and grandparents saying, oh, this why are we not doing this is important, and the bride and groom saying, no, this is not meaningful to us, we only want to do what is meaningful. So, we want equity in the ritual. So if,
Okay.
Yeah. So boy ties a Mangal Sutram, so girl will tie something else. So a lot of this stuff. So, so you have some older people, trying to sort of make the case that, hey, if you either follow it, or if you don't want to follow it, just have a social or, civic wedding, sign some papers. Why are you doing this, hodgepodge? But what my friend was saying is very interesting, is at every stage, whatever rituals they did keep and do, they had this sort of a performance where they would suddenly turn to the audience and, read out an explanation, now to some extent, I mean, I was also at one intercultural wedding a few years ago, where the boy was Indian Telugu American and the girl was Jewish American. And the funny thing was, most of the Westerners in that family wore Indian clothes. They were enjoying all the rituals. They didn't ask what does it mean. They were quite happy doing it. So I find it interesting where, increasingly there is this urge to self-define or explain or perform. There was another wedding now, another friend of mine, now there's 3 weddings. Oh my God, now I have to mention a funeral too, maybe, but okay, I'll just stick to 3 weddings. The 3rd wedding was also something like this, where I'm told, they had, before everything, they had like an explanation read out. But the most interesting thing was the MC or DJ said, "Oh, now we shall have chanting from the Vedas, which are an ancient tradition, which are not Hinduism." So
What?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
what was it then?
This is one of my
According
friends,
to
by the
them.
way. This is one of my most woke friends, quote unquote, very progressive, dear friend, but very progressive, annoyingly woke friends, who was so frustrated. He called me and said, "Man, what is happening? Maybe you have a point." So that's I think, yeah. So I think this like you just said, this, maybe we haven't been doing this for 1,000 years. That's fine, but I think we need to very quickly map the last 100 years at least, and we can map the last 100 years, if we really paid attention to, I think, this intergenerational flow. What were the practices your father did, your grandfather and grandmother did? What has changed? What has not changed? What are the things they kept? What are the things they abandoned? What are the reasons they abandoned some of these things? Why? Was it done under duress? So and also recognize the non-rational things. I said funeral, and I was reminded of this amazing movie called Balagam, right? This Telugu movie that earlier this year.
I saw that.
And it'll be very fascinating to watch that movie with young people, not just Hum Aapke Kaun or the happy movies. And I think there was a Hindi movie also recently about a family which has had a loss. I forget the name. And it wasn't too bad. By Bollywood standards, I thought it was okay. Not as powerful and raw as Balagam. But briefly, in Balagam, the story for your listeners is it's set in a village in Telangana. An elder, the patriarch, the grandfather dies. The family members all gather. And they're going through the, rituals, very matter-of-factly, because, everyone has their own concerns, inheritance, selling property, a love affair, this, that. And then suddenly they find out the crow is not eating the food they're giving.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole movie becomes about, something very profound, which is the fact that it is not YOLO. I think this YOLO belief is the single most crippling piece of propaganda on earth. So I'm not saying you literally have to believe in reincarnation and imagine your soul jumping like a dot, etc. I don't know. We need creative people to interpret that. But very simply understand the fact. And if you've lost an elder, you're doing the Masikam pujas, you're doing the annual puja, the shraddhas, and you're mixing these rice balls, you're giving it to the birds or cows or to the rivers. My God, you cannot help recognizing that your existence, your body is not your own. You have inherited a 3-generation, at the very least, legacy. And, at the end of the day, at the end of your life, whatever happens, I think a worthy purpose, a worthy goal is to live in a certain way that at least one more generation says, hey, these names need to be chanted, for at least 2 or 3 more generations. That, it's not just an economic legacy we have to leave for our children, but also a spiritual one. So, yeah, no, Balagam is, I think, will teach more than anything I can hope to do, It's a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
That's the power of media, right? The power of the
Exactly.
movie or the something you see on television. It just stays with you. And I wish we had more of these kinds of content that we could sit and watch together. Intergenerational viewing would really help, rather than just the happy wedding movies all the time. This goes a long way in starting these conversations with kids.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. I think one quick practical takeaway I would suggest, for parents is, when you do watch things together, and I think there is a disconnect because I do find a lot of our Hindu parents are not tuned into popular culture. Last year, there was a show called Addams Family on Netflix, and I was doing a talk and I asked for a show of hands in the Zoom room. And I found that, out of 25, 30 Hindu parents, almost all of them had not even heard of the show,
Neither have I.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, to be fair, I'm at an advantage because I'm a media professor, so I'm teaching 18 to 22-year-olds year after year, and I'm teaching about media and pop culture. So I think I tend to get a sense of what young people are enjoying a little more.
Consuming. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, it's a good idea to just, watch what they're doing together, keep an open mind on it, and ask questions, learn more. I mean, I think one good thing is, kids do know a lot more, particularly about technology, about pop culture and so on. So just learn more from the young, so learn more, just be a learner from both sides. I think that's the best thing that can happen to us. I mean, from our own teenage years till we are 30 or 40, we are so busy learning to survive, right? Studying, getting into college, getting a job, keeping ahead, all that. Now, everything else, I think, works well by just learning, both from our elders and also from our young. And as we learn from them, I think, maybe our youngsters will also learn that they'll learn to learn from us, so we don't have to become custodians of Hinduism or anything like that. We don't need to tell them like do it or else. Just have fun together. That's yeah.
I think what you're saying is be less of a parent in the transmission mode only, and
exactly.
Get into the ritualistic mode with them. And
well said. Well said.
Well, then maybe you'll have a better chance of having some influence, like we want to.
Yeah, I think ultimately, youngsters also will recognize at some point or the other that as annoying as parents can be, we have their interests at heart a lot more than school or state or church or corporation,
Yeah.
Right.
And what I'm recognizing in my study of the history of propaganda is, propaganda is designed so much to break vertical ties so that there is horizontal coercion, to create large armies of consumers, of workers, of, party supporters. So what youngsters are going through, from the time they're born is an experience of organized communication, which is designed to break their bonds with those older than them and also those younger than them. Just the fact that our classes are organized into age cohorts, all of this is just 100, 150 years old. It was never like that. So
I think that's what I think we are so blessed that, we have such a long history of the family being the central unit. It's been hard to break that, and we are still sort of standing, I think, because of that centuries and centuries of the emphasis on family and the community, so really thank God for some structures like that. Otherwise, we would have probably gone the same way as the West. We are reaching there for sure. But there's also, I think, a pushback and a recognition that we are trying to be boxed into these horizontal, groupings. So I think there is hope for us. Hopefully, we'll not succumb, like most of the West seems to have done, right?
Yeah, I think, the family, in a sense, is, the magic word over here. It sounds very cliched because, again, anybody who's growing up today is probably growing up with this idea that family means oppression and patriarchy and casteism and all these things.
More
And
buzzwords.
more buzzwords, exactly. So, I mean, and also let's not forget the fact that there are problems that exist in families, and children often grow up seeing the family as less than a perfect institution, whether it is conflict among parents or with siblings or extended family or I think it's hard to romanticize the family, but then luckily there are movies like Balagam, and in a different time and place, I think Hum Aapke Kaun was enormously successful because it presented to that generation going through a very rapid cultural change and economic liberalization that, hey, even if it's just a movie, look, everyone can be happy together, everyone can follow dharma and so on. So that was one time, Hum Aapke Kaun in the 90s, I did a audience research on it, thinking that I was going to, critique this movie and show how it's very oppressive and all that. But once I saw it and once I heard people talk about it, I learned from them. I wanted to say something about, the family, not just as, a normative idea of a family, but very simply as an institution which preserves intergenerational communication and existence. Normally in the old days it was 3 generations, and now maybe it's only 2, but all the same, I think it's very important to recognize that there are experiences of the world that those of us who call ourselves Hindu or Indian even broadly still have access to, intergenerational or multi-generational memories, which most of the world has lost. Okay, because the way I understand colonization now is, not just the economic part or one country taking over the economy and society of another country, but even internally, the question of how was Europe colonized, for example. If you look at it in generational terms, you're looking at, let's say, 20 centuries into 3 generations. You're looking at about 60 odd generations where you have this population which has been left in a limbo because they have been cut off from the traditional, transgenerational memories, their gods, their ancestor rituals, their festivals, etc. And they have been placed inside a worldview, an organization, a force, which seems to have only one directions, left, one set of directions, left or right. So they go through this one phase of revolution and the purge and uprising and so on. And then they go to the other extreme, then they will go to, extreme oppression and, totalitarianism and authoritarianism. They keep going back and forth. And it has reached such a point now where even that one institution they had for, the family to exist in time, to pass on some traditions and bonds, which is the church, has collapsed or is, rapidly weakened, at least in the US. So what I see happening in the US is, I think, a desire for people to find some kind of intergenerational continuity again, whether one wants to call it the family or religion or whatever else. But they just don't have the memory or the cultural resources to do it as well as we could be doing, And, this is, again, I don't want to get into Vishwaguru rhetoric or say that, hey, we can save the world and all that. But, the fact is that we are in a position where, I think we can revive a longer sense of, intergenerational memory as Hindus. That is something each of us could work on. And so what we really have to communicate, I think, is our place in time, not just our place in space, but our place in time. To conclude, I think watching interesting movies like Balagam, and whatever you watch or read with your children, I would say start talking about intergenerational representation. Okay? So, because let's face it, your children and maybe even you are now trained to recognize intragenerational representation issues, right? So, a lot of people today, if you watch a movie, immediately you're going to see patriarchy, you're going to see racism, you're going to see representation or misrepresentation in terms of identities, sometimes even when it's not there, so for example, there was this TV series called Never Have I Ever, which is about Indian American girl, on Netflix, which was quite popular. And people were criticizing it, saying, "Oh, but she's a Brahmin and she's praying to Brahmin gods. It's not showing them repenting for caste oppression." So, I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric or conversation that has been normalized in society now. So rather than keep fighting within the same space, which is so constricting, try and draw attention to intergenerational ties. So if you're watching Balagam or Never Have I Ever, or this new horror movie, what's it? I think it's called It Lives in Us or something. There's still a lot of stories in the popular culture, which are about intergenerational relationships, and I mean, even our own stories, Ramayana, Mahabharata, so much of it is about relationship between parents and children and, things like that. So I think the more we experience culture and communication intergenerationally, and the more we talk about it, and the more we train ourselves to look at what's going on in time, the better off our experience of communication will be.
Yeah, so I think we've covered a wide gamut of issues, I think, in this very, very interesting and engaging conversation that we have had. And seeing, Vamseeji, your hold on the media and the entertainment media in particular, I think we should have you back to do some some movie deconstructions for us.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah, so we will think of doing something like that.
Totally looking forward to that. And we never got to talk about media studies. I mean, even I'm really curious about what goes on there. And we should have you back to also enlighten our listeners on media propaganda. These are topics that we really need to get into at length the next time.
Wonderful. Maybe we can ask our listeners to do a poll and suggest a movie or a novel, and we'll focus on that and just talk about this in depth,
Sure.
I don't, maybe parents can pick a book that children are reading in school. I don't know, like 1984 or Animal Farm, or a popular Indian movie. I don't know. Anything. We can, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah. So it'll also get our audience also to participate, so they choose what we'll speak about. So
absolutely,
it'll be good.
And also we can do it ritualistically rather than deconstruct, through transmission. I think this should be fun. And
nice. No, that's why media studies classes are popular, because there is actually very little transmission. I mean, I just know there's a literature and there's a history to the field. I try to convey that a little bit, but most of what we do is learning together, watching a movie and teasing out, various readings and so on. It's fun.
Yeah. And my vocabulary has been really enriched today by especially these, theories of communication. And it's just opened up a whole new vista. And thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Vamseeji. So to our listeners, we would like to say that continuing on this theme of communication, Hindu Parenting will be conducting a communication workshop, but utilizing our traditional resources for today's communication skills. So we will be using the Alankara Shastra and the tenets of that to help children. We are particularly looking at teenagers to attend this workshop, and it would help them immensely in their communication needs for today. So the workshop is scheduled to start from 15th October, running through to 24th October, which will coincide with the Shera holidays of most kids, we would think. So any listeners interested in participating in this workshop, the information is there on our Substack platform, as well as on all our social media. So we request our listeners to spread the word around and tell people to subscribe to us. Obviously on our Substack, but also to subscribe and follow us on social media. We go by the handle Hindu Parenting on all social media. And this podcast and all podcasts are available on podcast platforms like Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Vamseeji, and we will have you back soon. And thank you very much for coming. So until the next time, namaste.